Welcome to Annette on Life, Liberty, and Happiness. Today, I want to talk about something that's pretty scary, but seems likely. At least one of these prospects seems likely. So, we can't ignore it. So, I thought I would talk about a few things that we need to look at. We can't bury our heads in the sand. So, things are getting pretty wacky, to put it in a fun way. Boy, we got to look at these last days as fun, right? Wacky. One of the things that I said in Sunday school a few months ago was that when I was teaching, so I teach gospel doctrine. And one of the things that I said was I need to remember that we know who wins the game in the end. So it's really just a question of how are we going to play, right? We got to put things in perspective. We know that things are going to end well. I was actually just having a discussion with an in-law recently who visited Adam on Diamond, and she shared that it's kept in a perfect or as perfect state as possible so that it's always ready for the Savior's return. Like, it's actually checked on monthly by a member of the 70. I did not know this. I don't think many people know it, but she gave me a lot of more information, but I'm not going to share it because it's obviously not out in the public domain for a reason. But I just found it very hopeful that there's this place where there's lots of property owned by the church, with more property being gained regularly, that is ready for the second coming. I'm ready for the second coming. Anyway. So there's two things, things are getting so crazy between red states and blue states, or left versus right, progressive versus conservative, or libertarian, or however you want to look at it, that there are a few different potentials. And one is that we have what's called a national divorce. That's been one of the things that's been thrown out lately. Another is civil war. So maybe we have both. I don't know. Maybe we have a big civil war that leads to a divorce, or maybe we can manage a divorce without a civil war, or maybe we have a civil war that ends with an authoritarian government. I don't know. Remember, the game is already won at the end. It's how you play. So let's look at these sort of scary ideas. I have this article from David Reaboy. I don't know, I'm pronouncing it wrong. I think it looks like it's Reaboi, David. And this is from Late Republican Nonsense. So it's called National Divorce is Expensive, but It's Worth Every Penny. The national divorce discussion prepares the ground for crucial thinking about what comes next in America as the country grows even more divided, bitter, and angry. For the last several years, I've been among a handful of commentators, along with good friends Michael Malice, Jesse Kelly, Michael Anton, and others, talking about the possibility or desirability of national divorce. Oh, before I get there, I wanted to read this other. I saw that there was a poll, and I mentioned this on my radio show not long ago, but there was a poll conducted not long ago that basically ended up with 43% of Americans wanting a national divorce. That's a really big number. I mean, and they said it was even more than that before a bunch of leftists jumped in to say, no, we don't. So more people on the right than on the left want this. Wonder why that is. Could it be that the left is trying to force their will on us? Anyway, back to this article. Okay, talking about the possibility or desirability of national divorce, the political separation of blue and red America, or to get more specific and inflammatory, the breakup or dissolution of the United States. This week, my friend Carol Markowitz has written a typically thoughtful piece on the subject at the New York Post, and concludes that as much as many people long for some kind of separation that would solve the many real problems of America's current disunion, it's not a solution that's currently feasible. And I went and I read that piece. She had some good points, but I think it was too conclusory. We're obviously heading somewhere. And so just to say it's not possible is not enough. We've got to look at the possibility. Back to the article. As with any breakup or divorce, even if we had a popular consensus for a national divorce in principle, there are all kinds of details, and massive, very thorny ones, like who gets which territories, populations, industries, or nuclear weapons caches, that could cause tumultuous and potentially violent negotiations. All these points of contention are very real and shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. They're not going anywhere. The seriousness of these issues and their daunting solutions are meant to prove that the breakup of the United States will always be an impossibility. I'm going to stop here again. I've been teaching a class on Pakistan for the last 6.5 years. And I don't know if you know this, but Pakistan was started from the partition of India into two countries. And so you had India on the east and Pakistan on the west, with a little piece of Pakistan up in the corner on the other side of India, which later became Bangladesh. But it was broken in half so that the Hindus could stay in India and the Muslims could go to Pakistan. Well, first of all, the lines were drawn very poorly by someone back in England who'd never been to India. And so there were a lot of things that were sort of left in bad places. So you had a bad split, first of all. You had a lot of things that people in Pakistan wanted that were back in India and vice versa. Then you had this migration, right? You had people going from India to Pakistan and Pakistan to India. And because there was so much contention between them, there were killings and rapings and all sorts of terrible things happening during this migration. So when I think about this idea of potentially turning into red states, blue states, and he's talking about how there would be, we'd have to negotiate who gets what. If just a split into two countries, and Kashmir is another story altogether, that was really a mess, and it's still a mess because it was done poorly. It wasn't given to either country, and they're both still fighting over it. But imagine that if you have one country split into two, and the difficulty that they've had since 1947, imagine trying to split 50 states up somehow. I mean, I don't know how we do this logistically. Okay, back to the article. But that's not right. National divorce or some other more tragic and chaotic outcome won't be impossible forever. Despite heaping dollops of patriotic propaganda, which admittedly is essential to maintenance of the citizens' faith in the regime, one day the United States will end. History teaches us that regimes, like all human creations, rise and fall, and world-bestriding empires fall harder, faster, and more surely than that. Admitting this is a possibility isn't as accurate as understanding it as a certainty. Yes, the timeline is hazy, but it's coming. So I don't know what to think about that. I mean, in all my years of living in this country, it's only recently that I thought seriously of the country dissolving. I mean, we kind of think of Last Days and that potential, but the probability of it, when I've thought about the Constitution hanging by a thread and eventually members coming up and saving it, I've thought that meant saving the country. I no longer think that's the case. I think, and if you've watched any of my other episodes, you know that I've said that I thought that there would be a potential of cascading secessions, which in this scenario, that may be the case, and that the various states that get together or stay off on their own many of them will hopefully embrace the principles of the Constitution, and that may be the way the Constitution is saved. I don't know. Okay, anyway, back to the article. And as one approaches the crisis and contempt between Americans builds beyond what is currently imaginable, those thorny points of contention, heretofore enough to reduce national divorce to a laugh line, become real objects of debate and deliberative thought. There is a price, for example, at which the hard work of pulling oil from the ground in a place is so prohibitively expensive, even discussing it seems foolish. However, when circumstances change, maybe global supply wanes and prices rise dramatically, areas believed to be too costly for drilling suddenly become feasible. It's interesting that those with the strongest objections to national divorce, and what's interesting is they have that in all caps because, I mean, they capitalized national divorce because now it's a thing. It's not just something that may sometime happen. It's now like, how do we manage this divorce? It's almost like a foregone conclusion. Objections to national divorce seem to base their admittedly legitimate worry about those horrific split-up scenarios rather than make a principled Lincoln-esque argument about the insolubility of the Union. Of course, appeals to boomer patriotism still exist, but I'm not sure if that kind of thing gets very many people going anymore. As that generation recedes from its long reign over the nation's political and cultural life to be replaced by a more combative cohort weaned on civilizational exhaustion and a sense of impending collapse, we'll see even less. I have to admit, I still have a lot of patriotism, but it is less about this country and more about the Constitution and the principles of our Constitution and just freedom in general, and not with the country specifically because of what's going on with the leadership and with a huge percent of the population, especially over the last 18, 19 months, when you see that a large swath of the country seems to want to be controlled. They're begging for mandates. It's unbelievable, but it is happening. And so it makes me less patriotic when I see this happening. I think it says a lot about where we are, what time it is, and how nearly all of us who follow political and social life here in America have a kind of understanding that there's no way back from our state of disunion. While there might be small valves like presidential or congressional elections to temporarily alleviate some of the pressure and sense of impending conflict, the issues on which we disagree are too profound and foundational to ever just recede into the background. In Closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom made a very elegant and convincing case that above other forces in human life, ideas matter most. I've thought about Bloom a lot as I've spent the last several years writing, tweeting, and speaking about the big things tearing America apart. As I've argued, the differences between red and blue America are far deeper than any issues we interact with on the surface. They're essentially pre-political, at least in the sense of a very temporal, issues-based, hot-button nonsense we consider politics today. The political philosophers, however, would say that the issues dividing us are absolutely political in the original and most elemental sense. We have in America today what are essentially two competing, radically different, and mutually exclusive conceptions of the good, of justice, and of the proper role of the state in its interactions with its citizens. Over the last decade especially, we've seen how these conceptions expand with great intensity and speed into areas that were once relatively apolitical and would have perplexed our grandparents, like the reality of human biology or its malleability according to ideology via the trans issue. As time goes on, even more of reality itself will become a battleground. If we disagree on these big things, which will necessarily manifest in every political issue, large or small, what strong force could possibly reunite us? Or to ask a question that's perhaps more pertinent, maybe not today or tomorrow, but soon, what force could keep us from coming apart? The most perceptive observers of America have known that this was always a perilous position for a large, multi-ethnic, ideological, or propositional constitutional state. As time goes on and the ideology on which the legitimacy of the state rests necessarily changes or becomes contentious between large segments of the population, what's left around which the great majority of citizens can rally? Not ethnicity or religion. These are two strong identity conceptions that have the power to unite people in smaller, less diverse states. Not patriotism emerging from a reverence for the nation's history and historic founding story either. The left has worked with great zeal to undermine all of these things because it wants to unite Americans under nothing but its own ideology. The 1619 Project is only the most successful, high-profile effort to undermine the legitimacy and, even more importantly, the virtue and goodness of the American regime and its founding. It, along with the related cults like critical race theory, forms a political ethos that has thoroughly consumed blue America. As the late Angelo Codevilla wrote, these differences amount to nothing less than a cold civil war, and the primary role of the responsible statesman is to prevent it from going hot. Codevilla's answer was that federalism, but the great man was wise enough to know that by itself, our old conception of federalism was no longer a reasonable or viable answer. That's hard for me to accept. I mean, I did an episode on this a while back on how if we would simply live up to what the Constitution put in place. We have 50 states, which are supposed to be 50 individual laboratories. where we could do experiments, and that's the way it's supposed to work. That's the way it has worked. But it's not working anymore because we have a federal government that doesn't care. Right now, Biden is doing things that he's been told not to do by courts. He has been sued by Texas, and Texas won, and he's not honoring that. And this is about some of the things that are going on at the border. This is a president that doesn't care. So when you have a federal government that doesn't care and is willing to step all over states and people, I don't know if federalism is the answer anymore either. I guess there's one possibility in that we know that next year, 2022, we're going to have an election, and I can practically guarantee you that both houses of Congress will go back Republican, but we'll still have Biden in the White House. So we can change some things, but will it be too late by then? I mean, we've got a vaccine mandate, right? That is forcing people out of work. We've got a border that's hemorrhaging illegal aliens into our country. We've got China and Afghanistan. I mean, there are a lot of things going on that I don't know if we're going to be able to turn around before something like this divorce is inevitable. All right, I'm going to keep going. For more than a century, progressives have dedicated themselves to abolishing the legitimacy of federalism and then reconstituting the federal government and the courts in order to make its application and practice all but impossible. Over time, as their fanaticism grew, the left's position hardened from the mere undesirability of local differences and state sovereignty to the illegitimacy, unjustness, and unfathomable evil of such an arrangement. So in other words, the left has made it look like federalism's bad. It's the whole, this is the other thing that we're seeing. What's bad is called good, and what's good is called bad. In order to return to a time of relative public consensus on these things, one side must impose its will on the other. While Red America isn't really interested in imposing its will on Blue America, it's clear that the reverse is emphatically not true. In a famous 1964 speech, Ronald Reagan said about last century's Cold War, "There's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender." This might be the unstated solution proffered by mainstream right commentariat, but is this the best we can do? Because it's just over the horizon of what we can imagine from our vantage point, national divorce isn't at all an immediate action plan, or at least I don't see it as such. Rather, it is a rhetorical strategy to prepare the ground for crucial discussions about what comes next in America as the country grows even more divided, bitter, and angry. More than anything else, it is a reminder for Red America to think about economic and cultural autonomy for itself and what it would take to get there. Autonomy for Red America is of crucial importance, regardless of the status of political or real separation. It is the ability for Americans to be self-sufficient from the financial, educational, and cultural institutions that are hostile to its beliefs and way of life and make reconciliation increasingly impossible. All right, so I think he's right in that we have got to have that discussion. And as I've said before, I think that we need to strengthen three things. If you've listened to me before, you know this. I've said this on the radio show. I've said it on my podcast before. But after reading a story where it talked about the federal government dissolving and states or regions becoming sort of their own little, fiefdoms, whatever they end up being, that we need to strengthen three things if we're going to stand without a federal government, right? Family, church, local government. And in one of my episodes, I talked about how we do that. So go back and listen to that if you haven't. But those things will help with whatever happens. Whether we have a civil war, then a divorce and then a civil war, or maybe just a divorce. That may be our best scenario at this point, is just having a divorce. The question is, how contentious would it be? And would it have... would there be violence involved when there is no agreement? And would the federal government attempt to stop it, which of course would become a civil war? All right, so the other article that I thought was pretty on point was, has America's third civil war begun? And this is on AIER.org by Robert E. Wright. The question of whether a third American Civil War has begun occurred to me after reading a recent New York Times piece, deliberately unlinked as it fails fact-checking, that claimed that the president can mandate a vaccine today because George Washington did so during America's first Civil War, more commonly called the American Revolution. Yeah, I had a lefty on Facebook trying to make this argument with me too. That much is true, but the article misses a few key differences. It was a wartime measure that applied only to soldiers. It was for smallpox, which was orders of magnitude more deadly than COVID. It was variolation, introduction of small amounts of the live virus into the bloodstream, not experimental gene therapy. I again called for a COVID variolation option on a voluntary basis. Did the New York Times admit too much by analogizing from a wartime scenario, or is it simply grasping at straws as usual? Maybe inadvertently, some of both. Thought that was interesting too, that they're comparing it. I think leftists think that if they invoke the name of George Washington, that we're all going to just immediately fall in line and not question it. The Revolution and the Civil War were both civil in the sense of being internecine struggles, but both were extremely uncivil in the sense that they were violent shooting wars that rent asunder families, towns, counties, and even entire states. Some people call the latter conflict the war between the states or the war of Yankee aggression, partly for political reasons, but also following the logic of Guns N' Roses. What's so civil about war anyway? Some claim that America is already in a civil, in the sense of non-shooting, war with China, which purportedly has deployed its three warfare strategy of legal, psychological, and public opinion distortion. That would not be surprising. The USA, of course, waged a long non-shooting conflict. Typically, I have to stop here really quick because if you have not read this book, Chaos Under Heaven by Josh Rogan, you really, really need to. This explains what's going on with China. And these guys, the communist government in China is Satan incarnate. I mean, I'm only exaggerating a little. They're bullies, they're murderers, they're liars. They don't care. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want, and they are all around the globe doing what they want. And I mean, I thought about doing an episode on it. There's just so much. There's too much. So I highly recommend again that you read this book, Chaos Under Heaven by Josh Rogan. And by the way, reading about how Trump handled them, not as impressed with Trump. He was all over the map on China. Didn't really care about the Uyghurs, didn't want to talk about the Uyghurs. Wasn't really a human rights person. So I don't want to offend you Trumpsters, but read this book and see what you think. I agreed with a lot of what Trump did, but I did not respect his stance on China until after the coronavirus. And then finally he gets on board with calling it the China virus. Anyway, okay. The USA, of course, waged a long non-shooting conflict typically referred to as the Cold War against the Soviet Union. During the decades-long conflict, the two superpowers shot at each other indirectly in places like Korea and Afghanistan, while also trying to destabilize each other with espionage, propaganda, and such. A non-shooting internecine war, a civil war, if you will, is also not unprecedented, but it is also not just politics as usual. There used to be rules and proportionality. It increasingly appears now that one side wants to annihilate the other at any cost, and that the sides are not drawn along strict party lines. Oh, also, before I forget, China is a real danger. If we do break up, either because of a civil war, or we have a national divorce, I guarantee you, China will be the first one there trying to help states, and especially blue states, or blue countries, whatever they end up being. I wouldn't be surprised if blue countries decided to ally themselves with China because China's got the money. And so if a civil war happened, I can also see China coming in and stepping in to help the blue side. So that's something that's really got to be thought about. All right. America's Civil War seems to pit sheeple against people. the brainwashed against those capable of independent thought, and safety first authoritarians against civil libertarians, left, right, and center. To admit that such a conflict exists does not require a conspiracy theory, just recognition of marginal incentives. Nobody planned America's first two civil wars either. They arose spontaneously from circumstances and incentives in ways so complex that historians still fight over the causal webs that ensnared people and governments in mortal combat. Of course, few Americans today want to throw down physically. We've got too much cool stuff and too many followers on social media to risk our lives. It would be a shame to get blood in our hot tubs, pools, or EVs. I had to look that up, electric vehicles. Moreover, although the sheeple might outnumber the people have more guns, but they really don't want to use them, which is not what the Brookings Institute thinks. You could tell as soon as I started reading this, I should have known better. This Brookings article on is the U.S. headed for another civil war? And of course, they make the argument, but of course, there's all these white Christian men with their guns that want to shoot us all. That was pretty funny. All right. The brainwashed, okay, to admit that such a conflict exists does not require a conspiracy theory, just recognition of marginal incentives. Nobody planned America's first two civil wars. Okay, sorry, I already did that part. Cancel culture was the first weapon deployed. Shame people on social media in the hopes that they will turn into sheeple and begin to follow the crowd, or at least injure their income. It often worked, but some people will not or cannot be canceled. If they lose their jobs, they sue their former employers or slanderous media outlets, jump to more lucrative careers on Substack, and so forth. Millions of others simply avoid social media or keep it strictly to sharing videos of crazy cats or laughing babies. Vaccines are a new weapon in the civil war, because they can be used to reach anyone and everyone. Mandates are not a perfect weapon because some rational free thinkers have gotten the stab after due consideration of their individual situations, while some sheeple consider doctors their alphas and follow individualized medical advice and not to get the Fauci ouchie. No weapon kills all of the enemy or prevents all collateral damage, so these instances do not militate against vaccine weaponization. That COVID vaccine mandates are about sorting sheeple from people and not about public health is made clear by several facts. First, if public health were paramount, the mandate would be to test regularly for effective immunity, not shot compliance. Some people do not need a vaccine because they have already survived COVID and have natural immunity far superior to that provided by even the most effective vaccine. In addition, vaccines are not equally effective for everyone. Health officials, therefore, should be testing frontline healthcare workers for immune response levels, not mere vaccine compliance. And of course, this is something that's I've been beating the drum on, and see my episodes with Dr. Barkey where we've talked about this. And natural immunity, the fact that natural immunity is not recognized, it's starting to become more recognized, but has not been recognized, is a huge indication that this is about control and not about health. Second, the mandates apply to remote workers and others who present no danger to the public. It's true. I have a friend that messaged me recently and he said, I work from home, but my company is requiring that I get the shot anyway. Hello? How does that make any sense? It doesn't. Why is there not a huge exemption in this rule for people who are remote workers? Things that make you go, If a COVID-19 survivor NGO, if a COVID-19 survivor's NGO has 100 or more employees, they all have to get vaccinated, even if surviving the disease is a prerequisite for employment. And even though scientists have warned that taking the vaccine probably does not help and may even hurt those with natural immunity. Third, encouraging the termination of non-compliant employees is unduly punitive. The chances of an unvaccinated employee, especially outside of healthcare, killing anyone is vanishingly small and virtually impossible to trace, at least if what public health officials claim about the vaccines is true, i.e., relatively few vaccinated people get COVID, few of those need hospitalization, and almost no vaccinated people die from or even with COVID. How is a minuscule risk of barely harming others worth somebody's livelihood? All the more amazing are reports that people terminated for noncompliance may not be eligible for unemployment insurance because they are being fired for cause. That will lead to some fun lawsuits because for cause traditionally means for doing something wrong, like stealing or not doing something right, like showing up for work on time. Sufficient cause was a concept that employers and employees worked out together, not a dictate from the executive branch of the federal government. It's a blatantly unlawful dictate at that. Corporations must start to contest unconstitutional federal policies. Imagine if Biden, in one of his delirious tantrums, said that corporations need to execute non-compliant employees. Would they do so? Presumably not. But by the self-styled progressives' own claims, firing or not hiring people is tantamount to slowly strangling them to death. I mean, they call it termination, right? Seriously, Newsweek in 2010, citing research, claimed that layoffs literally kill people. Corporations should team up, hire the fanciest of fancy lawyers, and defeat mandates and vaccine passports, or be counted as an enemy of the people. They can fund the legal expenses out of their oversized charitable donations budgets because saving the Constitution is the most important cause of them all. Has a civil war begun in America? I can't reject that hypothesis so long as irrational wars on the vaccine, non-compliant, innovation, and small business continue. If the authoritarians win those battles, free-thinking people who believe in human rights may have to capitulate or worse. So I don't know if by or worse he means national divorce, but obviously the main thrust of that article is that the red Americans are already being attacked by blue Americans. The federal government is already attacking people and states, so that we are in the middle of a Cold War, which we hope doesn't turn hot. But I wish I knew where this was going to go. I don't. It's not going anywhere good. I mean, yes, it would be beautiful if we could separate into a couple of countries, 2 or 3 countries, and, you know, they could be organized by color. I don't know how you do this, though, because states are all in different regions, right? It's hard for Florida and South Dakota to create a country. So you would have to do, like I said, if it could end up with a bunch of migrations of people moving from state to state or country to country. And, I mean, just the logistics are nightmarish. However, I think that the conversation does need to happen. We need to start having a national discussion. And we need to be serious about it, if for no other reason than to let the federal government right now, Biden, Congress, Democrats in Congress, know that we are not going to take this lying down. Not that we're going to start a hot war, but that we are not going to comply, and that we are already looking at ways to separate from them. So maybe, just maybe, if they saw enough of us were serious about this, they would realize that they're going to have to drop a lot of this nonsense. We're not going for a great reset. We're not going for vaccines, because what happens after vaccines, right? What's next? Well, I think children's vaccines would be next, right? And then after that, who knows? Lots and lots of possibilities. Again, read China. Read this book about China, because that's the kind of thing that lefties don't seem to have a problem with. So we don't want to become China or anything like that. So we've got to have these discussions. Again, strengthen those 3 things: your family, church, and local government. Get ready for anything. Prepare. I should have already put out an episode on Christmas presents you can buy for people who haven't started prepping yet, that are relatively inexpensive, and there's seed bags for 72-hour kits. So do that. Start praying. Start looking around and seeing what you need as in the way of food storage, water storage, money, supply. Start preparing for the worst, praying for the best, and start having those discussions. What would a national divorce look like? Because something's going to happen, and I don't know whether it's that or something else, but it's got to happen, because there are many, many, many of us who are not going to capitulate. And that's the other thing. Do not capitulate. All right. If enough of us stand strong, this vaccine mandate goes away, because they're going to realize there aren't enough doctors, there aren't enough police officers, there aren't enough nurses, there aren't enough truckers, there aren't enough airline pilots. If enough of us say no, then everything stops. Everything stops cold. So we've got to stand strong. All right. Thanks for listening to Annette on Life, Liberty, and Happiness, where freedom lovers gather.